I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, a boy disappears in San Antonio, Texas. 3 years later, he turns up in Spain. Or does he? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my captivating co-host, Alice.
Captivating. That's so nice.
Yes, that was Beth. Beth suggested captivating for you, Alice.
People are so nice. Thanks, guys, for helping Brett come up with words.
I know. I was running out of words, so it's nice. It's nice. I appreciate it. And we have a captivating story for you today. See how I made that transition? Perfect transition.
That was
right?
perfect.
Great. We have a very captivating story. We're going to be talking about, this is one of those where we're going to do a documentary. So I do the thing that I shouldn't do, which is tell you, if you have not seen the documentary, The Imposter, you should stop listening to us now and go watch it. And I know I say this every time we talk about a documentary, but this time, it may actually be true. There are a few experiences like seeing The Imposter cold. And I know, Alice, you walked into it having no idea what you were going to see, and I think you can vouch for me on that.
So I had truly zero idea walking into this viewing experience. All I was told was that I will be repeatedly picking my jaw up off the floor. And that is exactly what I did.
It's a truly amazing documentary. We're really excited to talk about it with you today. And we're going to talk about the documentary, and we're going to talk about what we learned from the documentary. But we also want to go deeper. We want to talk more about what really is a mysterious disappearance and possible murder that's at the heart of the documentary. And even though the documentary does not focus on that part, that is, to me, a really interesting thing that needs more focus. So that's something we hope to be able to do today. Before we get started, I do just want to welcome Green Chef as a new sponsor of the podcast. We'll be telling you more about them later.
I'm very excited about this, Brett. I love eating, so that gives you a little bit of a hint of what is to come.
I love eating too. Eating is fun. So anytime we get to talk about or sponsor or take part in any kind of eating thing, just know, people listening out there, if you have anything to do with food or beer or whiskey, hit us up because we totally want to be a part of that. I was thinking about this, True Crime Garage and their gimmick where they rate a beer at the beginning. Man, that must have paid off for them because now I bet they get like cases of beer showing up at their garage every week.
Oh my gosh, we could do a food tasting. Before we started, I just told you that my biggest regret walking into this closet to record tonight was I did not grab some snacks. I could really use some snacks right now.
There you go. A little innovation in the podcast. Maybe we'll have to start doing that. We'll work on that. We'll get back to that, guys. We'll
hungry prosecutors.
The hungry prosecutors. I like it. I'm always hungry.
I am always hungry. But anyways, back to the story. I'm also hungry for crime. True crime.
Back to the story. Let's talk about this story. So we are talking today about the documentary titled The Imposter. It's available now on Amazon Prime. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out, like you were saying earlier. And it's really about the disappearance and possible reappearance of a young boy named Nicholas Barclay. He was 13 when he disappeared on June 13th, 1994. Alice, why don't you tell us what happened on that day?
Sure. So on that day, Nicholas Barclay went to play basketball with his friends. And when he finished, he called his mom to pick him up. Now, his mom worked the night shift at the Dunkin' Donuts Dunkin' Donuts is much better than Krispy Kreme, by the way. But because she worked the night shift, she was asleep when he called to be picked up. And instead of reaching his mom, Nicholas reached his older brother, Jason. And Jason didn't want to wake up his mom because she had been working hard and needed her rest. Instead, Jason told Nicholas to just walk home. Nicholas was never heard from again. Now, initially, both the family and the authorities thought that Nicholas had just run away. He had done it before. His family life was difficult, and several of his family members were involved in serious drugs. Nicholas had kind of a tough life. He had his run-ins with kind of authorities already, and this was not out of the realm of belief for him to have run away. So that's what everyone thought happened. But Nicholas never stayed gone longer than a day when he did run away in the past. And despite that, the family actually waited 3 days before they called the police to report that Nicholas was missing. Now, when Nicholas failed to show up, the police realized that he was in some serious trouble. But despite their best efforts, the authorities were unable to find any leads as to where Nicholas had gone. He had essentially vanished into thin air.
And it's so unfortunate because, I mean, Nicholas he'd obviously had problems. We're going to talk about his problems. But the fact that he had run away in the past cost so much valuable time in this investigation. We've talked about this before. Somebody goes missing, a crime is committed. The police need to be on the scene immediately. They need to be looking into that as soon as possible. And every second that ticks by, it's evidence that's lost. It's people who might have been in the area who leave the area and never think about it again. People who might have seen things, who might have seen Nicholas get into a car, something along those lines. And in this case, it's not just a day that we lose. It's 3 whole days. And it is just not surprising to me, maybe a little surprising at the absolute lack of evidence the police were able to find when it came to Nicholas. But it's not all that surprising that they did not find him. That is, until 3 years later, when in October of 1997, the family receives a call that they'd been hoping for and praying for, but could not have imagined would ever come, and certainly couldn't have imagined it would come from where it did, which is Spain. Nicholas had been found alive. He apparently had escaped a child sex ring, and he was ready to come home. Now, like I said, this was a total shock to everybody. It was a shock to the people at the shelter in Spain when they heard this story. It was a shock to the people in the United States when they heard this story. And it was a shock to the family. Nicholas's sister, Carrie, flew to Spain to find her brother. Now, she had never left the country. She didn't have a passport. She certainly didn't have the money to go. Her work actually helped her out to fund her trip, and the State Department helped her to acquire a passport quickly so she could get out to Spain. And when she arrived there, she identified her brother, or the boy who was there, as Nicholas. She brought him home, but he had changed dramatically. Before, his eyes were blue. Now they were brown. His hair had been blonde. Now it was brown as well. And although Nicholas had spent his whole life in San Antonio, Texas, and its environs, he now spoke stilted English with a French accent. But the story Nicholas told convinced a lot of people that all of those changes were possible, because it was a story of absolute horror. He had been kidnapped by a sex trafficking ring. They had captured him, and they had chemically altered his eye and his hair color so that he could not be identified, and so that they could keep control over him. They had subjected him to years of abuse in Europe and had made him undergo psychological torture that had eventually changed his accent. Convinced, his sister brought him home. His family enthusiastically accepted him. For 5 months, Nicholas lived with his family in San Antonio. But as much as the family wanted this man to be 16-year-old Nicholas Barclay, he wasn't. He was Frederic Bourdin, a 23-year-old fraudster from France who had spent his life imitating and impersonating other people.
I mean, there's just question marks everywhere. All these changes, we're not talking about 30 years difference. I mean, people's eyes typically don't even change in 30 years, but we're talking about a span of 3 years that all these changes occurred. And yet his sister said, yes, that's my brother. That is Nicholas, and flew this French man home from Spain to live in their family's home in San Antonio as if he were Nicholas.
Yeah, actually ended up living with his sister for most of the time he was there, with her own son. There's a lot going on here, and obviously we're going to talk about this throughout this episode, but I think clearly they wanted to believe this. And you can understand that if your child went missing, you get this phone call, you're not going to ask too many questions. You're going to believe it. According to his sister, this man who was pretending to be Nicholas Barclay did look exactly like their uncle. Now, he went missing when he was 13. He comes back when he's supposedly 16. Obviously, there's a lot of changes that take place in a boy in particular between 13 and 16, so you could tell yourself a lot of things. Serendipitously, Nicholas Barclay had a gap between his two front teeth, and Frederic Bourdin also had a gap between his teeth. And as we talk about more as we go on, Bourdin was an incredible liar. He was really good at what he did, and he essentially was able to learn enough details about Nicholas that he could almost perfectly imitate him. We talked about this before. I think we talked about when we were talking in the Scott Peterson case. We said that the way to get away with a lie is you don't tell a big lie. You mix lies in with truth. There's a great New Yorker article on Frederic Bourdin. We're actually going to try and spend most of our time talking about Nicholas because Frederic, frankly, gets too much attention in this whole thing, and we'd like to get some attention on Nicholas, but it's impossible to talk about this without talking about Frederic. And in this New Yorker article, it's a long-form article. Search for it, read it. It's great. They interview him, and he says, he's talking about how you do this. And he says, the key is actually not lying about everything. Otherwise, you'll just mix things up. Keep it simple. A good liar uses the truth. And I think that's absolutely true. And what Frederic could do that is really impressive and is what a lot of fraudsters do, there's something called cold reading, where people can talk to someone and based on their conversation, they can pick up subtle, unconscious clues the other person's giving. Imagine you're playing poker with somebody. We always talk about, do you have a poker face? It's kind of the same thing. And when he was talking to the family members, he would pick up on little stories and names and connections, and then he would be able to bring that all back and put it together. And then he would use that information to get more information, oftentimes from other family members. So he learned something from the sister, and then he brings that story up with, his mother. And through that, he's able to slowly build up this persona where he is Nicholas.
And remember, again, I agree with you that when everyone talks about the Barclay disappearance, they really just talk about Frederic and not Nicholas, and I'd like to talk about Nicholas. But the thing with Bourdin is that this is not the first time he's done this. He has one of the longest rap sheets of identity theft I've ever seen, and not identity theft in the sense that you all may be thinking, where he steals someone's credit card number and pretends to be them in the virtual sense, but never having to assume their persona. He has taken on the personas of multiple people from multiple countries and fooled scores of people into thinking that he is someone else, someone who exists or existed at one time.
And not only had he done this before, but he did it afterwards. In 2005, he did this in France when he was able to pass for a 16-year-old when he was 30. And he ended up at a similar situation. I think it was like a convent or a school for orphans or whatever. And he pulled that off for months until somebody saw a story about Nicholas Barclay and what he had done there, and realized that guy looks just like random name kid who's at our school. And so he did this all the time, and he was really good at it.
But here's, as amazing as this story is, and watch the Imposter documentary, it is just shocking at every turn. If this is Frederick, then where is Nicholas Barclay? And as we often do, I think it's important to look at the timeline. So let's go to the timeline. June 13th, 1994, Nicholas is playing basketball, wants a ride home, is told to walk home, and then he disappears. Now, the timeline is a little bit fuzzy here. It's possible that Nicholas actually disappeared a few days before that, on June 10th, 1994, and that he wasn't reported missing until 3 days later.
And I feel pretty confident now that this is right. You hear different things, like different places that I would read and different articles and different podcasts and the documentary. They say different things about when he disappeared. It seems pretty clear to me that he was reported missing on June 13th, but he actually disappeared on June 10th.
And I understand why people may be confused, because you would think that a family typically will immediately report their 13-year-old child missing, but that wasn't the case here. Now, the next day, June 14th, there was actually a court date set for Nicholas Barclay, because as we had mentioned, he had a couple run-ins with the authorities. So he was supposed to appear in court on June 14th, 1994, the day after he was reported missing, which actually makes me wonder if the family waited until the last possible moment to report him, because he was going to be obviously not accounted for on the 14th. If the court was going to notice that he didn't show up, he would have been in contempt or just in violation of a court order to show up. And so they waited until the last possible moment, the day before, in order to report Nicholas missing.
I think you're right. I think this was another very unfortunate thing. There are a couple unfortunate things that come together that make this case possible. One of them is the fact that Nicholas had ran away before. The other one is this court date. I think those two things combined made the family think, well, he's run off. And like you said, we better not call the police, because he's going to be in even more trouble if we can't find him before this court date.
Yeah, and this is just for some juvenile crimes he'd committed. He was a 13-year-old boy. Like we said, not all 13-year-old boys get in trouble with the authorities, but he did have some run-ins. And, he was around family members who were in trouble with the law at times. And I think they couldn't wait any longer. Although I do think, just as a parent, 3 days seems like a very long time. But here we have a kid who's run off before, so maybe they're hoping for the best, that he's going somewhere to blow off steam. Maybe he was mad at Jason for not coming to pick him up, telling him to walk home. So he thought, fine, I'll show you, I'm not coming home at all. Now, what's interesting is, though Nicholas is reported missing on June 13th, 1994, several months later, on September 25th, Jason, Nicholas's brother, actually calls the police and says that he has caught Nicholas trying to break into their garage. But Jason reported that Nicholas was gone by the time the police got there.
Yeah, and this is important, and we're going to come back to it.
Right. Now, in October of 1997, so more than 3 years after Nicholas was reported missing, Nicholas is found in Spain. Now, as you've already heard from the story, it wasn't in fact Nicholas, but who the family and the world believes is Nicholas flies back from Spain, and for the next few months, who we think is Nicholas, lives with his sister and her now ex-husband. Now, he assumes the life Nicholas was living, as if he had just slipped right back into Nicholas's life. This Nicholas attends a local school, he meets a girl that he likes, and he seems to start to adjust to being back in San Antonio. But things are not perfect. He often fights with his sister's son. He threatens violence against his sister, and his mother, and like Nicholas 3 years earlier, he runs away. Now, he gets as far as Oklahoma one time before the police find him and return him to the family.
And it's interesting because this is what Nicholas was doing too, as we've talked a little bit about before. We're going to talk about more later. There was a lot of anger and violence in this family. So this, you might think, well, why wasn't that a red flag? Why didn't that make them think this isn't really Nicholas? If anything, it probably reinforced it. It probably was like, this is how Nicholas was before. Just imagine what he's going through now. It's only going to be worse. So none of this raised any red flags for them.
In fact, they probably thought, well, of course, this is completely in character with what Nicholas would do. Now, in February of 1998, so about 5 months after Nicholas comes back from Spain to live with his family in San Antonio, the FBI obtains blood samples that prove Nicholas is not, in fact, Nicholas, and we still do not know where Nicholas Barclay is.
Now, obviously, if you give a story like the one Frederick/Nicholas gave when he gets back about being part of a juvenile sex ring and having his eye color changed and all this other stuff, that's going to attract a lot of attention from the police. And it did here. It attracted the attention of the FBI. And I gotta say, the FBI does not come off well in the documentary. In fact, they come off as really gullible. There is this scene in the documentary where the FBI agent is going through the things that Frederick Bourdain told her, and everything about it should have screamed to her that this was not Nicholas. He gives her this crazy story about how he was abducted by members of the military, that he was kept in a room with other kids. They were shuttled around the country and eventually around the world on military aircraft, that he was chloroformed, that every night high-ranking members of American, Mexican, and European military branches would sexually abuse him, that they broke his fingers, they used a chemical to change his eye color. But rather than tipping her off, this just sort of horrifies the FBI agent, and she's convinced that no one would lie about all this or make all this up. And so she seems to be convinced that Nicholas is telling the truth.
What's so interesting about this, Brett, we've talked about it before, but she, even as she's being interviewed for the documentary, seems very emotional about this story. And we've talked about how when we interview witnesses, it may seem like we are uncaring, unsympathetic people, but we can't get drawn into people's stories. We can't get drawn into empathy or sympathy in the moment because we need to keep an emotional distance to properly evaluate what we're being told to see if it passes muster, if it's true. And she just seemed so enraptured by this fantastic story that she, even after the fact, knowing that it was a false story, seemed moved by the story.
Yeah, and if you read the New Yorker article, and we will link to that on our website, the story she tells there is different. It's possible that this is just a bad edit. Documentaries, they do this a lot. They need to create drama. She basically says from the very beginning, in the New Yorker article, from the very beginning, she had serious doubts that this was actually Nicholas Barclay. But because you have the family convinced that it is him and vouching for him, she felt like she needed to be very careful, and she really needed to line up all the evidence, which makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that if you're going to go out and say that kid who's been missing for 3 years and was found in Spain and was the victim of a sex trafficking ring isn't really who he says he was, you better know what you're talking about. Because if you say that and they do the fingerprints and the DNA and it's like, nope, it's Nicholas Barclay, that's bad for you. So she was in a really difficult place because on the one hand, you need to be sure before you make that accusation. On the other hand, if it's not him, then it's some random person who is living this life for reasons that are really difficult to understand without him telling you.
Yeah. And you know what was interesting? She even mentions that, well, the family know him best and they believe it's him. So almost like she didn't want to question them. And I know these types of cases are very delicate when you have a missing child, a grieving family. I can't even imagine if someone told me that I didn't know my own child. I would say, no, that's definitely my child. And so I understand that it's a delicate situation. But again, that's the investigator's job, is to assess the facts.
Right. And eventually, what it took for this to fall apart was a private investigator and the old television show Hard Copy. I don't know if you guys remember Hard Copy or not, but back in the 80s and 90s, I think it was Hard Copy and Inside Edition, and there might have been one more. And they were these sort of news magazine type shows, kind of like TMZ almost, but a little bit more newsy. But all the stories were like this. They were all these dramatic, crazy stories. And Hard Copy decided to do a story on Nicholas Barclay, which makes sense. And we'll talk about that in a second and how that unravels everything. In the meantime, the FBI is still looking into this, and they eventually take Nicholas to Houston to be evaluated. There, he speaks to a doctor, and the doctor immediately recognizes that something is very, very wrong. There are a couple things that tip him off. He realizes it's basically impossible for this to be Nicholas. He isn't showing any of the signs of the kind of trauma he is describing. So he's saying the words, he's describing what happened to him, but he's not showing any of the effects. There's none of the sort of post-traumatic stress that this doctor would expect to see. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, different people react differently to trauma. That's 100% true, but there are other problems that are deeply physiological. It is basically impossible for Nicholas's language to change the way it did. Nicholas is incapable of speaking without a European accent at this point. And that defies everything we know about the brain and about language. You don't spend 13 years of your life in West Texas and then in a matter of only a couple years, not only lose your accent, but gain another one. I can say for myself that when I lived in Boston for 4 years or however long I ended up being there, my accent did lessen. It wasn't as thick as it was when I left. But then as soon as I came back south, it came back with a vengeance, as you can now hear. And that's the way language works. It's just not possible for him to have this change. In the same situation with his eyes, there's just nothing that actually does that to your eye color. There are a few drugs that have side effects that can slightly change your eye color, make your eyes a little bit darker than they were before, but nothing that could change eye color as dramatically as Nicholas is claiming. And so this doctor, he feels very confident that this is not Nicholas. But even with that, you have the situation where the family just refuses to believe it. The doctor, he talks to the FBI, and the FBI is now convinced, okay, fine, this isn't Nicholas. And the agent actually calls Nicholas's sister and says, this is not your brother. We'll take care of it. And then in one of these sort of shocking moments in the documentary, they get back to the airport, and there she is waiting on him. And so she takes him home, just sort of to the amazement of this FBI agent.
That is shocking. I mean, sure, there's denial, but it's interesting that they let him go with her despite finding this out.
Yeah, I feel like they were just being probably overly cautious here because, number one, it should have been pretty easy to get his fingerprints. I mean, they're with him all the time. Just take a Coke bottle that he drank and take it back to your lab or something. But it's never clear to me, in reading the articles on this and watching the documentary, still not clear to me why it took so long for the FBI to take sort of definitive action here. Because whatever the family thought, you have somebody who now is in the country illegally, and we have no idea who this guy is. And one person that bothered a lot was Charlie Parker.
Right. Now, the way they eventually figure out who Frederick was a PI, Charlie Parker, knew that ears are like fingerprints. So the way your ear is shaped is actually incredibly unique to who you are. And when Parker compared the ears of Frederick with a picture of Nicholas, he knew that Frederick was an imposter. He knew that there was no way the ear could have changed, and the unique fingerprint, essentially, of the ears gave away Frederick. Now, Charlie Parker called the FBI and told them. The FBI told him not to intrude on a federal investigation. Thankfully, we now know, because of the way this worked out, Parker actually ignores the FBI's directive, which is always a risky thing to do, and in fact is regularly in contact with the Barclay family. Now, when Nicholas's mom takes him past his elementary school and Nicholas does not recognize it, she claims that for the first time, it was this experience that she began to doubt Nicholas's story. Now, it's that night that Nicholas threatens her with a baseball bat, and Parker comes to her home to intervene and essentially save her. Now, he and Nicholas agree to have breakfast the next morning, and it's there that Nicholas, or Frederick, admits to the truth.
Yeah, and he tells him, "My name's Frederick Bourdain. I'm wanted by Interpol." It's a crazy moment. I'm sure it was a crazy moment for Charlie experiencing this, and from that point forward, basically, this all falls apart. He's eventually arrested by the FBI. We'll talk about what happens to him afterward. But like we've been talking about, nothing really explains why the family is so hard-headed about this. Now, his mom says that finally this event with the elementary school is what changed her mind. Even that seems to be maybe a little bit of a retcon on her part, that it maybe wasn't necessarily like that at the time. And one of the things about this story that's really hard to figure out is exactly what the family was thinking and when they were thinking it. And there's a moment in the documentary where everything sort of changes, where you're watching this doc. It's so well done. It's so well done. And there's this moment where the whole time you've been sort of watching, amazed that Bourdain is getting away with this. And you just can't believe it, and you don't really understand it. And then you start to hear more about Nicholas and more about Nicholas's disappearance and more about what Frederick thinks might have happened to him. And it all kind of clicks. Then all of a sudden, Frederick, who's been the villain the whole time, is kind of no longer the villain, and the shift happens. And it shifts from what he did to what happened to Nicholas. And frankly, that's kind of how we're going to do this too. We've talked about Frederick a lot, but we do want to talk about Nicholas. And I don't think you can talk about Nicholas without starting off by this reaction that the family has to Frederick, even after, like we said, even after the FBI tells them that this can't be their son, it can't be their brother. The family continues to allow him to live with them. They refuse to give blood or DNA for the family to test. They refuse to allow the FBI to take any blood or DNA from Frederick. In fact, they refuse to assist the FBI at all.
And Brett, we've always said it's hard to interpret people's reactions to traumatic situations, to a family's grief. And there's some world where I can imagine that a family is grieving so much that they don't want to know the truth because they want this so badly to be Nicholas. But there comes a point when this belies any sort of believability, when the FBI is telling you you have a dangerous criminal who is wanted internationally in multiple countries living under your roof. You would think that would normally shake even a grieving family out of any sort of denial that they may be in hopes that this is in fact their son, their brother. And you even hear his sister say this. She continues to kind of push this story that she didn't want to believe, because if this wasn't Nicholas, then where was Nicholas? And that was too scary for her to even think about where he might be and what sorts of horrors he may still be living if he were alive. All that to say is, I can only take that so far. But then when you find out from law enforcement, the leading law enforcement agency of the federal government, that you have a dangerous internationally wanted criminal living under your roof. It should snap you out of it.
And the thing about it is the sister, she starts off doing this, right? The weirdest thing about this story, and the sort of thing that you have to think about, and Frederick talks about this. There's this moment, Frederick is somebody who uses people. He's a con man. He's a fraudster. In some ways, I have this sort of grudging respect for Frederick because he's familiar. He's the kind of person we deal with all the time. He's the kind of criminal we deal with all the time. We see this all the time. And when you do this a lot, you always try and have respect for the people that you're prosecuting. You try and remember these are people too. They have unique lives and challenges, and there's a reason they came to where they are. And it's important to remember all that. And so you end up having this sort of unusual relationship with these folks that's difficult to describe to people who've never done it before. And I kind of felt that way about Frederick. As I'm watching it, I get him. I understand what he's doing. I don't approve of it. Let me be clear. I do not approve of what he's doing. He's not a good guy. He's not the hero of the story at all, and he doesn't need to be sort of praised any more than, frankly, he is in the documentary. But I get him. I understand him. I can't wrap my head around what this family is doing, and it starts with the sister who, she goes over to Spain, and one of the things they have to do, the Spanish authorities are like, we don't know about this. This seems crazy. And so they have this hearing where Frederick has to prove that he's Nicholas. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to have him look at photographs and identify people in the photographs. And if he can identify them, these are family members. If he can identify them, then he's Nicholas. If he can't, then they'll know he's lying. Well, before this hearing happens, his sister sits down with him, or his supposed sister, sits down with him and goes through the photographs and tells him who everybody is in the photograph. So then when it happens, he's able to pick them all out. And about halfway through the documentary, he remembers this and talks about this, about how weird it was. Like, why is she doing this? And his theory is because she needed him to be Nicholas, because Frederick thinks the family knew that Nicholas was dead. And they knew that someone in the family was responsible for his death. And this, Frederick's the one who's supposed to be using them, but all of a sudden, they're using him.
And that's a chilling part of the story when Frederick realizes that he may not be the only fraudster under that roof.
Yeah, he thinks he's the hunter, right? And all of a sudden he's the hunted. He thinks it's kind of like a great twist in a horror movie or something where the bad guy all of a sudden realizes, oh no, if you've ever seen Hard Candy, it's like hard candy. But yeah, it's an amazing moment. I mean, it's one of the most amazing moments in any documentary I've seen.
Frederick does have this unique perspective because he does live under their roof post Nicholas's disappearance for 5 months. And remember, his profession has been doing these cold reads, picking up on things that are unsaid, and he's living with these people, seeing them every single day. And his conclusion is that they know Nicholas is dead. And now, whenever there is a child missing, obviously suspicion turns to the parents. So let's talk a little bit about Nicholas's mother. Beverly was addicted to heroin at the time of Nicholas's disappearance. Now, she has taken 3 polygraph tests. You know how we feel about polygraph tests. We think they're deeply flawed. But whatever you think about them, she did take 3 polygraphs, and she passed 2 of them. On the 3rd test, the polygraph operator said she lied so much that the machine practically jumped off the table. Beverly just claims she was nervous. She wasn't lying, she was just so nervous. But it might be that, after 3 times, she can hold it together for 2, but by the 3rd time, you kind of get worn down. This is a tactic in interrogation, by the way. You get asked the same question repeatedly over time because you get tired and you let your guard down. Of course, it can go both ways, right? You've heard of false confessions coming out when someone is just so tired and so berated with questions, they'll just give you whatever answer they want. But there's also the result that you start answering truthfully because you're so tired you can't keep your story straight anymore. And that might be what's happening here.
This is really weird. I found this to be very strange and a weird tactic because if you watch the documentary, the FBI agent basically says that she thinks she's lying. She thinks the mother's lying. She thinks Beverly's lying. She thinks Beverly knows what happened to Nicholas, knows where he is. And so she has the guy give the first polygraph, and he comes back and says she passed. And so he says, well, do it again. And so he does it again, and she passes. And she says, do it again. And he does it again, and she fails. And it's almost like she was going to make her take this polygraph until she failed. And I don't know that that's really good polygraph practice, even to the extent polygraphs are helpful. Okay, but there are other reasons to think that the family knows more than they're letting on. So let's talk about Nicholas, and let's talk about his home life. Nicholas was only 13. We talked about this earlier, but he had already lived a difficult life. By the time he disappeared, he had 3 homemade tattoos. He was only 4'8" at 13 and weighed 80 pounds. The average 13-year-old boy is about 5'2" and 100 pounds. So, 4 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier. That's pretty significant.
And if you look at his picture of around the time when he disappeared, he really does. He looks like maybe a 9-year-old boy rather than a 13-year-old boy.
And you wonder how much of that is because of abuse and neglect, that he's just not, he's not getting the food he needs even. And this is obviously a difficult family. The father's out of the home. The mother's addicted to drugs. Nicholas is growing more and more angry at his life and angry at his mother and the situation that he lives in. And despite his size, like I said, he's 4'8", 80 pounds. His home is marked by violence that he is often the instigator of, and his mother would often have to call the police on Nicholas, even at this young age. And she would say when she called the police that Nicholas would strike her, that he was hitting her, that he was physically abusive towards his mother, and became so bad that she asked his brother, his older brother Jason, to move into the home to try and control Nicholas. That really didn't work. And it's unclear if Jason was really the person to do that, given that he also was having problems with drugs. In any event, Nicholas rarely attended school, and he did have quite a juvenile record. He had broken into a convenience store. He'd threatened a teacher. He'd stolen some shoes. And he had reached a point where he had this court date that we talked about earlier, and there was a possibility they were going to send him to a group home, that, warnings and probation and picking up trash on the side of the road wasn't working. And the authorities were going to take the next step, remove him from the home, and put him in a group home setting where he could find some discipline. And this was something that he deeply did not want. As bad as things were at home, the story everyone tells is that he was terrified of this possibility, which is just another part of this perfect storm, that he's going to have this court date. There's a strong possibility this thing's going to happen to him that he really doesn't want to happen to him. So when he disappears, just a few days short of this court date, it just adds to this feeling that the boy with the problems who had disappeared before probably just ran away. He'll probably come back. Let's wait to tell the police. And then by the time they do tell the police, he's already gone, and there's really no trace of him left.
Yeah, it really is so sad. It really is, like you said, it's such a perfect storm. Now, let's talk about Jason, Nicholas's brother. Now, Nicholas's friends noted that when Jason moved into the house with his mother, the house changed. Jason was a drug addict, and he kind of brought this energy with him to the house that was not a positive.
And remember, the story here, when he disappears, there's only one person who talked to him. We know he went to play basketball. We know that happened. His friends confirmed that. But the story that we're told is that he called home for a ride. He talked to Jason, and Jason said, your mom's asleep, walk home. And the only person we have who can confirm that is Jason himself. So you got Jason, who shows up at the home, who's doing drugs. His mom's doing drugs. Jason is not exactly an upstanding character. And all of a sudden, Nicholas disappears, and the last person who talked to him was Jason.
And that's not the only interaction that witness is Jason. Remember, Jason called the police in September after Nicholas had been missing since June, and he claimed that Nicholas was trying to break into the family's garage, but he told police that Nicholas fled when he saw Jason coming towards him, and that he was gone by the time the police arrived. So the interesting thing about this, if you're thinking about why would someone make this up, is all of a sudden you place Nicholas alive and in the area months after he last disappeared. It could throw a wrench in any sort of thought you may have had of him being far away from San Antonio or that he might be dead. Even though Jason reported this, no one actually believes this story. Jason was the only one who claims to have seen this. There's no real explanation as to why Nicholas would be trying to break into the garage. Was he trying to get into the house? Was he trying to come back home? But then why would he flee? Nothing about the story really jives. And unfortunately, we won't really ever know the truth about this allegation because in 1998, Jason died of a cocaine overdose.
And the thing about Jason, and the thing about this sighting, this is the kind of stupid thing a murderer does to try and cover up the fact that they killed somebody. Now, the family will tell you now that nobody was looking for Nicholas, and why would you fake this? Number one, I don't believe that. I'm sure the police were not keeping the family all that up to date on what they were doing because the police probably figured the family had something to do about it. Obviously, it's possible Nicholas was kidnapped. It's possible somebody picked him up. It happens. We've talked about cases where it happens, and we'll talk about cases where it happens in the future. But there's nobody who saw that. There's no evidence of that. There's nothing really to indicate that Nicholas was kidnapped. The last person who talked to him was Jason. And then all of a sudden, Jason calls with this story, which is a lie. This didn't happen. Nicholas wasn't trying to break into the garage. That didn't happen. He lied about that. Nicholas was already dead, and he knows that. And the interesting thing, he tells this whole story about Nicholas breaking into the garage, and then Frederick comes back. Frederick's story is completely incompatible with that because Frederick says that he was kidnapped at the basketball court. He says that's where he was kidnapped. Basically, somebody came up, they offered him a ride, they kidnapped him, and then off to Europe he goes. So even with Frederick's made-up story, Jason is lying, and the family should know that. And you would think somebody in the family would be like, hey, what about that whole story you told about somebody breaking in? He was in Europe at the time. Like, what was that about? And Jason did not go to meet Frederick at the airport. He really had no interaction with him at all. There's one story that Frederick tells about how he's at a party with the family, and Jason shows up and sort of like looks at him and says, good luck to you. That's basically what he says. And there seems like there's a couple reasons for that. Maybe Jason's just the one jaded person in the family who realizes that the chances of this actually being his brother are really slim. Possible. Or maybe he knew that there was no way this was Nicholas because Nicholas wasn't alive anymore. And that's the thing that makes the most sense to me.
Obviously, we know that Frederick is a fraudster, and he had probably more lies come out of his mouth over the course of his lifetime than truths. But speaking about what he observed in that house and what he thought happened is compelling. You have to take it with a grain of salt because we know his profession is lying, but still, he saw how the family interacted. And when you kind of dive into what each of the family members are like around the time of Nicholas's disappearance, there should be alarm bells going off. There's something going on. Things don't add up. So what are the prosecutor angles here? We have a boy who we don't even know exactly what day he disappeared on. And there's never been another trace of him. Unlike other missing person cases, there's been no sighting of him. There's been no parts of his belongings, a backpack, a shoe, a shirt, nothing that's been uncovered somewhere, whether in San Antonio or elsewhere. It really does seem like he disappeared into thin air.
Yeah, it does. It seems like, I think there's a reason he hasn't been seen since that day that he disappeared. And it's because I don't think he saw another day. I think he was killed that day. And we'll talk about our theories here in a second. But it's difficult it's just difficult to believe that Nicholas is still alive or was still alive or anything other than his murder happened. We reached out to Charlie Parker, who is still interested in this case and still trying to figure it out, to see if he had anything he wanted to add. And he emailed us back. It was very nice of him to do so, and essentially said that when the documentary came out, they got a lot of tips and they were very hopeful, and they ran all those tips down and there was just nothing to them. And they really kind of hit a brick wall, and they're still at that brick wall, and now they're raising money because there are a few places they want to do ground penetrating radar to try and see if maybe a body's buried there. But problem is, this is West Texas. We've mentioned San Antonio, but really where they are, it's not even San Antonio. It's not even the city. It's sort of the rural area outside of San Antonio. And if you wanted to get rid of a body in that area, I think there are so many places you could do that the chances that if Nicholas was murdered and his body's disposed of at the time, I guess it's just not all that surprising to me that he has not been found.
And remember, Brett, for the 13 years of his, life that was accounted for, he couldn't stay under the radar. Right? He was always on the authorities' radar. He couldn't get away with stealing shoes. He couldn't get away with breaking into stores. He couldn't get away with truancy. He was always caught because he was 13. And for him to completely disappear and never have another run-in with anyone, whether with the law or with, just people on the streets to see him and recognize him, is a huge flag to me that he is, like you said, dead. He would have still been 13, 14, 15, still very young in terms of savviness of avoiding detection, avoiding authorities. It's just unlikely that he has never been detected by anyone, hasn't shown up on anyone's radars, when the first 13 years of his life, he was on the radar all the time with the authorities.
Yeah, people, and we talked about this before, but whenever somebody disappears, there's always somebody who says, well, maybe they ran off and started a new life. And you could say that about Nicholas. Nicholas had no money. He's 13 years old. He didn't run off and start a new life. He was either kidnapped or murdered.
And that was the other thing. He's not a 13-year-old who could pass as an adult. Someone would see him shopping in the grocery store and say, where's your mom, little child? Because he looked like a little child, not like a teenage boy.
Right. And even younger than he was. Like he said, he looks like he's 9 or something when he disappears. Now, one thing that did happen is Frederick was charged with a crime. He was charged with passport fraud and perjury. He pleaded guilty to that. Now, and he was charged in federal court. Whenever you're charged in federal court, there's something called the sentencing guidelines, and it's this really lengthy book. There's a sentencing commission, and the way federal sentences are handed down is judges are given this guideline range, and it takes into account all sorts of things. It takes into account all kind of different aspects of your crime, what you did, who you are, your prior criminal record, any problems you've had in your life. There's also mitigating factors that you can take into account. And the whole purpose of this is so that if 100 different judges see the same person in 100 different courts, they're going to give essentially the same sentence. We want to make sure that there's some uniformity in sentencing. But ever since a case called Booker and Apprendi before that, the sentencing guidelines are not binding on federal courts. So the judge does not have to give a sentence within the guidelines that they receive. In this case, Frederick's sentence had a guideline range of a max of 2 years in prison. The judge thought that was wholly inadequate for the crimes he committed, and he actually ended up sentencing Frederick to 6 years in prison, so 3 times what the guideline range called for.
Which kind of shows you the extent of Frederick's, and that was likely based on Frederick's vast criminal history, and also the egregiousness of this particular crime and the international trickery that it involved. But that is well outside of the guidelines and kind of shows you the depth and complexity of his crime. Now, what are our theories then? So because of what we said, that Nicholas is just gone, I think something bad happened to him. I don't think he ran away. And so really we're left with two theories. And the first one I don't think is very likely, but it's that Nicholas was kidnapped. So he was walking home from the basketball game, and though it's only about a mile or two from his house, someone sees him, somehow gets him into his car or offers him a ride, and instead they kidnap him. The problem with this is that no one sees him getting into a car. Remember, he left a basketball game with friends. There were people around. No one saw him get into a car. There were no reports of an individual also leaving town or driving through town. There's no spotting of Nicholas elsewhere. So while, of course, it could have happened, there's just absolutely no evidence pointing to it except for the fact that Nicholas is gone.
It's just hard to support a theory that just doesn't have any evidence. I mean, the only reason this even is a theory is because this happens to people, right? I mean, he's a 13-year-old boy. He's out by himself. He's walking home. Kids get kidnapped. It happens. There are famous cases. Johnny Gosh is a good example of, a car drives up, grabs a kid, and drives away. But in that case, like most cases, there were a lot of witnesses who saw that. The notion that he disappeared into thin air with no evidence whatsoever, it's just kind of hard to believe. It's kind of hard to believe that happened. It's impossible to prove it did not happen. It may very well have happened, but we have no reason to think it did. There's really no reason to think it did. And frankly, the only reason to even think it's possible is because Nicholas's brother reported that this is what Nicholas was going to do, that he was going to walk home, that he was going to be in a situation where something like this could happen. And that brings us to the other theory in this case, which is that Nicholas's brother killed him, that Jason murdered Nicholas. And I think that's what happened. I think Jason did murder Nicholas, and I think the family probably either knows that happened or strongly suspects it. We know in the weeks after Nicholas disappeared, the police were called to Nicholas's home a lot. There were a lot of domestic disturbances between Jason and his mother, where the reason given was that they were fights over the fact that Nicholas was missing. Now, the way they would spin it is she was just upset. He should have gone to get him. He didn't go get him. He disappeared. That's possible. But what ended those fights was Jason saying that he saw Nicholas. This story that he tells about Nicholas breaking into the garage, that was sort of the culmination of that. And look, I think the real story of the Imposter, if you watch it, is that this is a fraud that could only come off if the family allowed it to happen. It's certainly the case that anyone would want to believe that their son was alive, but this level of self-delusion is on a stage and a level that is almost impossible to imagine. And we talked about this earlier. The genius of the documentary is not just in the telling of the story of Bourdain, but it's the moment where everything turns and you can see Frederick realize this insane world that he's gotten himself into. That he's the fraudster who's now all of a sudden in the midst of a fraud, and he realizes that Nicholas is dead, that Jason knows that Nicholas is dead, and more importantly, that probably at least some members of the family know it too. I don't know that the sister knows it. I don't know that the mom knows it, though I think there's a reason she ended up failing that one polygraph. And, the only person who never treated him like he was Nicholas was Jason. Jason never bought in to the lie, and he would later tell the FBI that the reason he didn't treat him like Nicholas is because he didn't believe he was Nicholas. The FBI thought he was involved. The police thought he was involved. They were all coming around to this idea that Jason had killed Nicholas. Obviously, Charlie Parker thought that as well. And almost immediately after that became obvious, Jason died of a drug overdose, an overdose that most people believe was essentially a suicide. And I think Frederick kind of summed it up best when he said, quote, "Some of them did it, some of them knew it, and some of them chose to ignore it.
Brett, I think that is very likely what happened, and how deeply sad it is for Nicholas, because no matter how troubled he was, no matter how much trouble he was in with the law, at the end of the day, he's just a 13-year-old boy. And you look at this photo of him, and he's just a young boy dealt a hard hand. And to think that his family may have known that he was murdered and was covering up for it is just so deeply sad for him, as no one really knows his story. And your family is who's supposed to, keep the light burning for you, metaphorically. And here they are trying to snuff it out so that no one can find out the truth.
And it's sad because even now, his story isn't the one that's told. It's always Frederick's story. Everything's told through the lens of Frederick. And that's one thing we wanted to try and do, was talk more about Nicholas. It's hard to do because it's hard to find any information about Nicholas, because so many people just, if you Google Nicholas's story, you get all these articles about Frederick, which is fine. And Frederick is an interesting guy, but I would like to know more about Nicholas and what happened to Nicholas. And I hope that Charlie Parker is able to continue to do the work he does. I do want to say one thing about Frederick. When you're watching this documentary, he is so manipulative, and he is so good at manipulating. He manipulates you. As you are watching it, you are being manipulated by Frederick. Like he is playing you. And it's a really interesting thing, and you have to keep that. You have to remember that the whole time, even as he's telling you things. A lot of the things he's telling are definitely slanted. Now, there's one thing I will say about Frederick. Frederick has an incredible ability to read people and to figure out people's secrets and to figure out, what people want to hear and when they want to hear it and all these other things. And I don't trust Frederick. I wouldn't trust Frederick at all. I certainly would not let him out of my sight if he was at my home, because he knows what he'd steal from you. But the fact that Frederick is convinced by this, I think if Frederick could ever give up his life of crime, he'd be a pretty valuable resource for the police, because he's kind of like Sherlock Holmes in that he can see through people. And I think he saw through these people. And I think he saw to this truth, and it enabled him to continue to manipulate them. I don't buy this whole thing that he was ever scared or worried. I just think he probably loved the fact that they had murdered Nicholas or knew who did, because it just meant they could never betray him. They could never turn him in. They had to keep playing the game as long as they could, because it was valuable for them too. So crazy case, crazy story. Hopefully one day there's some resolution and we find out what happened to Nicholas. Hopefully Charlie Parker will be successful in his efforts as he continues his search. I know you guys have to have thoughts on this one. Please reach out to us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod, for all your social media favorites, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Go hang out on the gallery on Facebook and talk about this case. We swing by there every now and then if you want to get ad-free episodes. And also, another thing we do if you're on Patreon, not only do you get ad-free episodes, but if it's a multi-part series, this is not one. We actually did one episode for once. You can binge those. You get all the parts at the same time. So
that's a big deal, guys. We drop them all at one time.
It doesn't mean you have to go maybe a couple weeks without new episodes. You have to balance things. But if you like to binge, that's one way you can do it. Shout out to our good friend Hannah Hill, who I'm glad she has recovered from her bout with COVID. And she was still doing artwork for us even as she was going through COVID. And I tried to keep her from doing that, but she's just too committed to her art. So she kept doing that. So shout out to her. Please support her. Go check her out at Serious Moonlight on Instagram. Also support our sponsor for this show, Green Chef. Well, Alice, is there anything else we need to talk about before we sail off into the sunset?
No, but I can't believe that we actually did an entire case in one episode this time.
I know. It was very difficult for me to keep all my random stories out of this one, but I'm proud of us. I'm very proud of you, Alice.
Well, until next time, Brett.
Until next time. In the meantime, keep leaving those 5-star reviews on Apple. We love to see those, but We will see you guys next week with a new case, new questions, and new answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Try not to be arrogant in this one. Is that what we are? Arrogant? Full of ourselves?
Which is so funny. You're like the least arrogant person I know.
Oh,
maybe I'm arrogant, but
maybe
you're
you
the
are.
least arrogant
No.
person I know. Maybe I am. Maybe we're both arrogant and can't see it.
Maybe. That would be what an arrogant person would do, right?
Huh, that's true.
We'll try not to make fun of Austria today.
Stop laughing at Austria.
Sorry.
Jeez. You are so insensitive.
So insensitive to Austria. Struggles. Okay, let's...
I'm kind of... Keep going. Nothing. I was just going to say that I regret my decision not to grab a snack before I came in my closet.
Ready to rock and roll?
Oh, yeah.
Ready to roll and rock?
Oh, yeah. Oh, rockin' and roll.
Rockin' and rollin'. All right. Me.